I'm very honored to be invited to talk to you all, and I'm looking forward to today. And I thought that what I would do at the beginning is just tell you what I'm going to talk about, and also invite you to ask me questions if you have questions that are prompted by something that I'm saying. And if you just have a general question or comment or observation, that I'm definitely going to save, or planning to save enough time at the end of our session so that people can express it at that point. But I want to invite you to ask me a question when that question comes up, if I'm going to run the risk of losing you or confusing you if you don't ask me then. I don't know how many of you have read the book that I think is the subject of today's talk. It's called Confessions of an Innocent Man. If you just hold your hand in front of the camera, then that'll give me a sense. Okay, so I know that I will not, I know that some people haven't, and maybe you'll be interested in doing so as a result of today's talk. And I hope that's the case, but since I know that some of you haven't read it, I'm gonna be very careful not to spoil anything. And so if I think that I'm going to say something that's going to be a spoiler, then I'll have a spoiler alert so that those of you who haven't read it can mute me or stop listening for just a moment, and then we'll come back to it. So the first thing I wanted to talk about today actually is how it is that I started doing death penalty work, because the book is a book about, at some level, the death penalty. It's not entirely about the death penalty, but obviously there's an important strand of the book that's about the death penalty. And so the first thing I was going to talk about is how I came to start representing people on death row. And then the second thing that I was going to talk about is why I wrote this book. And we'll see how far into the hour that gets us. And if it doesn't get us terribly far, then I'll talk about some specific aspects of the book and why I chose to do what I did. But otherwise, we'll just maybe open up the floor at that point. I've been representing people on death row now for really most of my professional life, for 25 years. Most of my clients are in Texas, but not all of them are. I have 3 or 4 clients in Florida. I had a client in New Mexico before New Mexico got rid of the death penalty. And so I have some experience with the way the death penalty works in several different states, but most of my experience is in Texas. And over the 25 years that I've been doing this, I have hired or supervised probably 30 or 40 different lawyers. And almost all of the lawyers that I hire or supervise are young women or men who already know when they are in law school that they want to be death penalty lawyers. They're drawn to the issue of capital punishment, either because they have strong philosophical views about the issue of the death penalty itself, or because they're interested in criminal justice more generally, and they believe that working on death penalty cases is the most intense type of criminal justice work that people can do. And what that means is that every single person who I've hired or supervised in my years of doing this work is different from me in a fundamental way. And that fundamental way is that when I started representing people on death row, I, number one, had very little interest in the death penalty as a philosophical matter. And number two, to the extent that I was interested in the death penalty, I was in favor of it. So I came to the work from a really different vantage point from the people who I hire, but I don't regret that, because I think that it gives me an ability to understand and empathize with the arguments of death penalty supporters in a way that many people who represent death row inmates simply don't have. The reason that I started representing death row inmates is because I was teaching a course at the University of Houston Law School on what is known as habeas corpus law. The writ of habeas corpus, I don't know how many lawyers are in the room, and even probably most lawyers don't really know a whole lot about the writ of habeas corpus. But the writ of habeas corpus is a legal procedure that has very deep roots in the English common law tradition. It goes back at least to the era of the Magna Carta, and some scholars of English legal history believe that it actually goes back even to the 12th or 13th century. And essentially what the writ of habeas corpus is a device that allows people who are in the custody of the government, and custody obviously is a euphemism for in prison or in jail or incommunicado. It allows people who are in the custody of the government to challenge the legality of that custody, and it places the burden on the government to justify holding that person. Habeas corpus literally means hand over the body, and so what happens when somebody files a writ of habeas corpus is the government is required to present the body to a judge, and the judge then tests the legality of the conviction. I was teaching a course on the law of habeas corpus, and it so happened that at the time that I was teaching this course, most of the important habeas corpus decisions that were being decided in the United States were death penalty cases. Not all of them, but most of them. I tell people that if I were 15 years younger than I am, I probably wouldn't have been a death penalty lawyer at all. I would instead have been one of the lawyers who represents detainees at Guantanamo Bay who were moved to Guantanamo Bay after 9/11, because it so happens that since 9/11, the most important habeas corpus decisions have grown out of the so-called war on terror. And I got interested in the death penalty because of my interest in habeas corpus. And so if I were 15 years younger than I am, 20 years younger than I am, and still had the interest in habeas corpus that I had as a younger lawyer, it would have so happened that the important habeas cases were cases that involved people at Guantanamo Bay. And I probably would have been one of the lawyers who was shuttling back and forth between the US and Guantanamo Bay to represent my clients there. But in fact, I'm as old as I am. And so the important habeas corpus decisions that were being decided when I was teaching habeas corpus were cases that involved death row inmates. At about the same time that I was beginning my career as a law teacher, the federal government, Congress, was creating what were then called resource centers in the southern states. Resource centers were essentially small public interest law firms that were charged with the responsibility of finding volunteer lawyers to represent death row inmates. At that time, there were a little bit over 1,000 people on death row in the United States. And there were only a handful of lawyers with the skill set to represent them, because death penalty law is extremely specialized. And so in about 1990, the federal government passed a law that guaranteed a lawyer to death row inmates when the death row inmates were challenging their sentences in federal court. But at that time, Texas still did not have a law that guaranteed death row inmates a right to have a lawyer in their appeals. And so somebody would get convicted and sentenced to death, and the person had a right to a lawyer at his trial. And I say his because almost everybody on death row in the United States, 98-point-something% of the people on death row in the United States are men. And so it would be precious to say his or her. There are a handful of women, but most are men. And these death row inmates did not have a right to counsel. And so Congress had created these small little law firms, and the law firms were going to represent some number of death row inmates themselves. But of course, you can't represent all that many people on death row at a time because the cases are very demanding. And so mostly what these organizations were going to do was going to be to recruit other lawyers and then to essentially hold their hand and walk them through the process of representing death row inmates. And I knew just by coincidence a number of people who were starting these resource centers in the United States. And I also knew the ones who were starting the resource centers in Texas. And so because I was teaching habeas corpus law and because the habeas corpus decisions involved death row inmates, I thought it would further my education to go to death row and meet some of the people who were the subject of these cases that I was teaching in my habeas corpus class. And so I went to death row one day about 30 years ago, and I met 8 or 9 guys that day. And as I was leaving the prison with a friend of mine who had taken me there, he asked me whether I would be willing to represent one of the guys who I had just met. And I said to him, gosh, I don't know anything about this. I've never represented a death row inmate. In fact, I'd never done a criminal case before. My trial experience was as a civil litigator, redistributing wealth from one rich company to another rich company. And I didn't know the first thing about representing criminal defendants, and certainly didn't know the first thing about representing a death row inmate. And I said, and besides that, I'm not really even against the death penalty. And the person with whom I had gone to death row said to me, well, here's the reason you should represent this guy. He has an execution date in 2 weeks, and his volunteer lawyer, because of course at that time, death row inmates were not guaranteed a lawyer, so they were counting on volunteers. My friend told me that his volunteer lawyer had written him a letter the day before saying he just wasn't going to be able to work on the case. It was too stressful to him. They are stressful. They're not obviously as stressful on the lawyers as they are on the client, but the lawyer had written the client a letter saying, I just can't do this anymore. And so my friend said to me, I don't really think that it matters that you've never done one of these cases, because you'll do a better job than this guy will do representing himself. And the question isn't whether you're for or against the death penalty. The question is whether you are for the death penalty, even if it means executing somebody who doesn't have a lawyer, even though his appeals aren't finished. And that's just a hard sell to say no to if you're a lawyer in the United States, if you're a law professor in the United States who is teaching about the importance of equal justice under law and the right that everybody has to be represented by counsel. I understand, obviously, as somebody who's grown up in the United States, I understand that what one has access to in the United States is in part a function of wealth. If you're rich, you can fly on a private airplane, and if you're poor, you've got to take the bus. And if you're rich, you get better quality medical care than if you're poor. And if you're rich, you get better food than if you're poor. I understand all of that, and that's the price that we pay for a capitalist system. And I think my own personal view is that on balance, the pros outweigh the cons. But the one area where that's not supposed to be true, the one area where wealth is not supposed to matter, is when you confront the criminal justice system. You're not supposed to be able to get away with crime if you're rich, and you're not supposed to be punished for crime just because you're poor. And yet, this was obviously one of the features that I discovered early in my experience with the criminal justice system. And so I agreed to work on that case. I agreed to take on this client's case because he had no other lawyer, because he had appeals left, and because he had an execution date staring him in the face. And if I wasn't going to do it, who was? So I worked on that case, and I found it extremely rewarding in many ways. I found it rewarding intellectually because the issues are very challenging, and I found it rewarding spiritually because I felt like I was evening the playing field at least a little bit. You can never entirely even the playing field when you have the government on one side and a private individual on the other, but you can make it harder for the government. And I found it very emotionally satisfying because over the years, I ended up keeping this guy alive for about 8 more years before he was finally executed. And over the years, I got to know him, and I got to know his friends, and I got to know his family. And so by the time he was finally executed, and as a general matter, by the time my clients are finally executed, if they are, and most of them are, I've gotten to know them. And so I have a bond with them, not just a lawyer-client bond, but I think a different kind of bond that results when you literally have somebody's life in your hands and somebody is literally counting on you to save his life. And so one case led to two, and two led to four, and four led to eight. And the next thing I know, I wake up and I'm a middle-aged lawyer who has become a death penalty lawyer. But as I say, the choice was not one that I made when I was in law school or even when I was a young lawyer. It was a choice that I made entirely by accident. I think in part as a result of how I came to do the work and the fact that I was doing the work for so long, I decided I wanted to write a book about what it was like to be a death penalty lawyer. I had written by that point a number of academic books, books that were aimed at experts in the field, other books that were aimed at people who were not necessarily experts in the field, but who had some expertise in some area of law. And I reached the point that I wanted to write a book for a general audience about what it was like to be a death penalty lawyer, because I had come to the conclusion over my years of representing death row inmates that there were a lot of misunderstandings that the larger society had when it came to viewing death penalty lawyers. They, I think, often viewed death penalty lawyers as people who didn't have any sympathy for the murder victim or the victim's family. They came to view death penalty lawyers as people who were trying to put dangerous criminals back on the street. They came to view death penalty lawyers as people who thought that criminals should be coddled. And I thought that all of those views were wrong, and they certainly were not right when it came to me, and they also were not right when it came to most of the death penalty lawyers that I know. And the universe of death penalty lawyers is pretty small. So if you are a death penalty lawyer, you know just about all of them. And so I wanted to write a book about it, and so I wrote a book. It was a memoir. It was called The Autobiography of an Execution. And it was really just about what it's like to be a death penalty lawyer in Texas. It focused on one particular client of mine who I believe to be innocent. And I should also say at this point, I suppose, that I've represented at this point about 115 or 120, mostly guys. I've had 3 women who have been in that group of clients I've represented. And I have had 7 or 8, I say 8 because I have a serious question about one of them. I've had 7 or 8 who I think are innocent. 2 of them were released from prison as a result of the work of my team and me. One of them died while he was in prison before his appeals were over. 3 were executed, despite the fact that I believe they were innocent because I couldn't persuade the people whose opinions matter that they were innocent. And 2 of them are still alive. Their cases are ongoing. So the final chapters of those cases haven't been written yet. But it means you have 115 or 120 clients on the one hand and 6 or 7 or 8 on the other who I think are innocent. And it means that most of the time you're representing somebody who killed somebody or who killed several people. The first book that I wrote, though, was about one of the people who I believe was innocent. And the reason that I chose somebody who is innocent is not because I wanted to perpetuate this idea that there are a lot of people on death row who are innocent, because there aren't a whole lot of people on death row who are innocent, but rather because the burden of representing somebody who you believe to be innocent is a lot heavier than the burden of representing somebody who you don't believe to be innocent. When one of my clients gets executed, one of my team's clients, because I work on these cases with other lawyers, and so I don't do anything by myself. I do everything as a member of a team. And when one of our clients gets executed, one of the things that we do within the next 48 hours after the execution is we meet to go over all of the decisions that we made in the case, Some of the times we've been representing somebody for 7 or 8 or 9 years. And so there are a whole lot of decisions that we've made if we represented somebody for 7 or 8 or 9 years. Some of the times we might just have been representing somebody for 7 or 8 weeks. And so there are going to be many fewer decisions that we have to go over. But we go over every decision and we ask ourselves, was this the right decision? If we had done X instead of Y, what might have happened? And it can be very dispiriting to do that, because you realize when you go and reverse engineer the cases that you've worked on, that there have been a great number of nodes in the decision tree where you could have gone left instead of right. And when somebody has been executed and you're going back over that decision tree and asking yourself, gosh, maybe we should have gone right here instead of left, and then maybe this client would still be alive. I've had lawyers who work for me or with me, and it's their very first case, and at the end of this session, they're in tears because they're thinking, gosh, I made bad decisions, and as a result of that, a client got executed. And what I always say is, at the end of these sessions, I say, we've sat here and as a result of this exercise, we're going to serve our next client better. But we've discovered that there may be a bunch of decisions we would have made differently today, knowing what we know now as opposed to what we know then. But I always say, but at the end of this story, we wouldn't be sitting here if our client hadn't made the first mistake. If our client hadn't killed somebody, then we would not have to be reverse engineering every decision we made. And that isn't something that I can say when we're sitting there with a client who we believed was innocent. When we're sitting there with a client who we believed is innocent, then when we get to the end of the analysis where we've identified all of our errors, we don't have the luxury of saying, but if only the client hadn't made the first mistake, because the client didn't make the mistake. And so I wanted to write this first book called The Autobiography of an Execution about one of those clients we believed to be innocent, because I didn't want there to be any psychological safety net for me or for my team. And then after that book, I wrote a second book. The second book was called Things I've Learned from Dying. And that book really weaved together 3 different stories. It weaved together the story of one of my clients who was executed. It weaved together the story of my father-in-law, who was Peter Glockner, who died from metastatic liver cancer. And it weaved together the story of the best dog I've ever owned, who died from liver failure also. And all 3 of these things were happening in my life at the same time. I was having a client who was on a straight rail to the execution chamber, and my father-in-law was very sick, and my dog was very sick. And so I wrote this memoir about trying to deal with all 3 of those things at the same time. Both of those books, I should say, were on balance, I would say, favorably, reviewed. I was very flattered by the venues where they were reviewed, and I was generally flattered by the content of the reviews. But I'm also not a writer who says I don't pay any attention to reviews. I don't say I never read the reviews. I actually do read, the reviews, and the laudatory ones flatter me, and the negative ones I try to learn something from. I mean, obviously, if it's a negative review that doesn't really offer me anything that I can learn from, then I can't learn from it. But there are a lot of negative reviews where I feel like I can learn something from it. And so I try to do that. So I read these reviews. But there were 2 common elements in the reviews of both of my memoirs that got under my skin a little bit. And to tell you why they got under my skin, I should take a step back and tell you, especially for those of you who are neither lawyers nor the mother or father of a lawyer, nor the spouse of a lawyer, that lawyers have certain obligations to their clients. There's something called the attorney-client privilege, which means that what the client tells you as the lawyer is something that you can't repeat to anybody else unless the client tells you to do that. And then there's also something called the duty of confidentiality, which is even broader than the attorney-client privilege. And the duty of confidentiality requires the lawyer to keep confidential everything that the lawyer learns about the client in the course of representing the client, even if it doesn't come from the client. So if I'm representing somebody on death row and I learn something about my client from a teacher or a friend or a prison guard or a spouse, whatever it is I learn is covered by the duty of confidentiality, and I can't disclose it without the consent of the client. And that duty of confidentiality, it continues even after the client is dead, continues forever. So what does that mean if you want to write a book about one of your cases? Well, one of my very good friends is an ethics professor. And so I asked her, how can I write this book where I want to write something that's not just about the legal proceedings, because that's really kind of boring. I want to write about what it was like to actually represent this person and know this person and talk to him and his children and his parents and his friends and his teachers and the people who he met while he was in prison. And her advice to me was, well, you shouldn't write the book. That was the way that was guaranteed to make sure that I didn't violate either the duty of confidentiality or the attorney-client privilege. She said the second best choice, and it's a distant second, is to change the identifying details so that you make it not necessarily impossible, but very difficult for somebody to figure out who you're writing about. Okay, so if I had just written a book and I told you that I represented a Black guy who committed a murder in San Antonio when he was 26, and the victims were 2 white females, and he was executed when he was 34, you could sit down with a computer and put those details into a search engine, and a handful of cases would pop up, and maybe only 2 of them would be Texas cases, and one of those cases is going to be the one I'm writing about. And so I've therefore violated the attorney-client privilege, and I've violated the duty of confidentiality because I've told you who this person is. So I made the decision that what I was going to do is change certain identifying details so that a reader wouldn't be able to do that. So that I would say that a crime that had really occurred in San Antonio, I would say that it occurred in Del Rio. And the crime had really occurred in 2011, but I would say that it occurred in 2007. And in reality, there had been 5 victims, but I would say that there had been 3 victims. And so I would change those sorts of details, not because I thought they mattered. They didn't really, at least in my view, matter to anything that had to do with why I was writing the book, which is what it was like to represent this person. But I was changing those details. And so with respect to both of my memoirs, both Autobiography of an Execution and Things I've Learned from Dying, there were some reviewers who were critical of me for making those choices. And of course, one of the reasons that the reviewers were critical is because those books were given to journalists to review. And obviously, if you're a newspaper reporter and you change those sorts of details, you have violated something very fundamental about what it's like to be a journalist. You know, if you say something happened in Del Rio and it happened in Corpus Christi, that's a very important fact, but it didn't seem important to me in the context of what I was writing about. And so I was talking to my agent one day, and he was congratulating me, in fact, on a review. And I said, I'm actually very irritated about this review because she has once again criticized me for changing these details, saying that as a result, the book can't be fact-checked. And I said, I don't care whether it can be fact-checked. This isn't a work of history. It's not a work of journalism. This is a memoir. And you just have to understand that I'm forced to change these details. And if you're going to be skeptical about the truth of the underlying story because you don't know where some crime occurred, well, too bad. And so I was having this conversation with my agent, and I said, I think the only way I'm going to be able to escape these sorts of reviews where I get criticized for changing these sorts of details is to just write a novel, because then nobody can complain that I'm making things up. And my agent asked me, he said, that's a great idea. Or do you have one in mind? And it so happens that I'd already been thinking about the general story of this book. So I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. And he said, do you have any pages written? And I said, I have a few pages written. So I sent him the few pages that I had written, and he encouraged me to continue working on it. And as a result, this novel was born. And this novel is, as you all know, is called Confessions of an Innocent Man. And it's divided into 4 parts. And it is not a spoiler alert for me to tell you that the main character in the book is convicted of a murder that he didn't commit, and he's sent to death row as a result of being convicted of that murder that he didn't commit, and he gets out. He gets off of death row. And the reason it's not a spoiler alert is because there is a prologue in the book. And if you read the prologue carefully, then all of the things that I just told you, you know, in the first 8 pages of the book. And then the next, 300 pages or however long it is, you're working your way back to the prologue to figure out how he got there. I wanted to have a central character who was innocent for a couple of reasons. One is that I wanted to call attention to a feature of how it is that innocent people end up on death row. Sometimes it's because they have bad lawyers. When I first started doing the work that I'm doing, it was usually because they had bad lawyers. But in the last 10 years, the quality of the trial lawyers in particular has gotten very much better. But as I think more people's eyes are open to today than was the case a year ago or maybe even 6 months ago, even though the quality of lawyers has gotten better, the deeply entrenched racism in the criminal justice system hasn't gotten all that much better. And so I wanted to have somebody in the book who had a good lawyer, but who was also brown-skinned rather than white. And you'd much rather be white if you are on trial in the criminal justice system in the United States than you would want to be black or brown, because the odds are much better for you. I tell my students in my death penalty class that if you're going to kill somebody and you want to stay off of death row, you really, to the extent that you can, want to control 3 things. Number one, you want to have enough money that you can hire a really first-rate lawyer, because that matters. Number 2, and you can't control this, but you'd rather be white than black or brown if you're going to kill somebody. And number 3, you'd rather kill somebody who is black or brown than kill somebody who's white, because people who kill people of color are much less likely to be sentenced to death than people who kill a white person. So in the book that I was writing, I wanted to have at least one of the strands of the story call attention to that aspect of the world in which we live, in the criminal justice system that we have in particular, which is that dark-skinned people are treated more poorly than light-skinned people. And then the final theme that I wanted to explore in the book, aside from the death penalty themes, was this phenomenon that I actually first noticed in one of my cases that wasn't a death penalty case. I represented a young man, oh gosh, this was, I think, happening about the same time that our son was born. So our son is now 20, so it would have been about 20 years ago. And I was representing a young man who had been convicted while he was in high school of a rape that he didn't commit. And he served 5 years in prison before my team and I proved that he didn't commit it, and he got out of prison. And I remember going to the press conference that he and his mother and his sister had on the steps of the courthouse as he was walking out after being exonerated. And I noticed something happened then that I then noticed 2 other times with my own clients, and many, many more times with other people's clients, which is that these guys, not always people of color, but usually people of color, these guys who get convicted and go to prison and they get proven innocent and get out of prison and have a press conference with a throng of media in attendance, they're always so forgiving and understanding. These are people who have served 5, 10, 15, 20 years in prison. Sometimes they've served that time on death row. Death row is a horrible place, but prison in general is a horrible and violent place. And they have survived all of these years or decades in this terrible, violent place, and they come out and they just seem so even-keeled. They're not bitter, they're not angry, They talk about what they're going to have for dinner that night and sleeping in their own bed and getting to sleep until whatever time they want and getting to go to sleep at whatever time they want. And I would watch this time and time again. And there was only a single case that I knew about of all of the exonerations, of the several dozen exonerations that I knew about. There was only a single one where there was somebody who got out of prison who struck me as really angry. And even he wasn't really bitter. He just had been wrongfully convicted in Texas. And he said, I'm leaving Texas and I'm never coming back. But that was really kind of the extent of his anger. And I just couldn't imagine myself being that forgiving and understanding of people who might have sent me to prison for something I didn't do. And so I wanted to explore that theme in the book also. What if you had somebody who got out of prison who, rather than just smiling and saying, I'm going to put it all behind me, I'm going to go on my way, had really a lasting grievance that he felt he needed to attend to before he would be able to move on with his life. So I think that is what I want to say by way of background about why it is that I wrote this book and the general themes of the book. And if people have comments, questions, observations, etc., I'd love to hear them. And if there are questions, I'll try to answer them. And I don't know if you just want to, if people start to talk over each other, then maybe we'll have to raise hands. But otherwise, if you just want to weigh in, I think we can. Yes, go ahead.
Question. This is Warren. You mentioned the people that get out after being wrongfully convicted and come out. Do many or any of them talk about suing the system for monetary damages?
Yes, thank you, Warren. That's an excellent question. For all of the bad things that you can say about the criminal justice system in Texas, the criminal justice system in Texas now has the most generous compensation for people who are wrongfully convicted. So if you're wrongfully convicted, I don't do this work anymore myself, so I'm not 100% sure that I'm right about these numbers, but I think that I am. I think that if you're wrongfully convicted, you are entitled to $80,000 a year for every year that you were in prison after being proved innocent. Now, and that is very generous compared to other states. No other state is as generous as Texas when it comes to compensating people, per year for wrongful convictions. The truth is, you have to jump through all kind of hoops in order to get that money, but it's easier to jump through those hoops than to actually file a lawsuit, and it's just an administrative matter to get that money. I myself do not know anybody who would be willing to spend a year in prison for $80,000. As I said a moment ago, there's this myth that prisons are comfortable places where everybody has free internet and cable TV and high quality exercise facilities and all of that. It's basically a myth. I mean, on death row, I can tell you, on death row, you spend 23 hours a day in a 60 square foot cell that has 4 solid steel walls. There's not even a door with bars that you can see through. The door is also solid steel. There's a slot that flops open that's called a bean hole, where the food trays are passed through to you. And when you're going to be taken out of your cell, the purpose of that so-called bean slot is that you turn around so that your back is against the door. You put your hands behind you so that the guards can reach through and shackle you before they have to open the door. Then you step away from the door, the electronic door opens, and you're already shackled. There's a tiny slit of a window. If you're well behaved, there's 3 levels of death row. Level 1 is for the people who are well behaved. Level 3 is for people who have really messed up, and level 2 is kind of the in between. If you're at level 1, which is the best row, you're supposed to get an hour of exercise a day, but the exercise just means that they move you from your 60 square foot cell into a larger cage that's called a day room. There's no actual exercise equipment. It's just a bigger space where you can walk around. You're supposed to get 3 showers a week, but you don't always get 3 showers a week. Breakfast is served at 4 in the morning. Lunch is served at 10 in the morning. Dinner is served at 4 in the afternoon. The food is crappy. And so a lot of guys on death row survive by ordering food from the commissary, which they can do only if they have some friend outside of prison who's putting money into their commissary account, because they don't earn any actual money when they're in prison, because the guys on death row don't have work privileges anymore. They don't have television sets at all, much less cable television. If they have enough money, they can buy a radio from the prison commissary, but the only radio they can buy is the one that is sold in the commissary. And it's just an old FM radio like people used to have on their bedside tables, 20 years ago. And there are about 3 stations that you can get in Livingston. Now, a lot of these guys on death row are very ingenious, and they can use other materials that they can buy from the commissary to rig the radio so that they can receive stations from farther away. And the guards generally look the other way, but if the guards don't like you, then once you have modified the radio, it's defined as contraband and they can take it away. So this is life on death row, And so would you live in that circumstance, for a year for $80,000? I mean, I know I wouldn't. I suppose there are some people who I would, but that's all by way of saying, Warren, that the compensation system in Texas is very generous compared to every other state, but still not anything that most people would trade a year of freedom for, much less 10 or 15 years of freedom.
I don't know how to answer the question.
Marcia?
Hey, I'm sorry. Who pays your team for defending these people?
Excellent. You do. So we're appointed by, there are 3 different types of well, really 4, I suppose. There are 4 different ways that we work on cases. One way is that we are sometimes, a death row inmate has a trial and then has what's known as a direct appeal. And the direct appeal is in state court. And then after the direct appeal, there's something called the state habeas appeal. That's in state court. And then after the state habeas appeal, there's a federal habeas appeal. That's in federal court. And then it's done. So there are those 3 different layers of the appeal. People on death row can waive the 2nd or 3rd layer if they want to. Some of them do, but you can't waive the 1st. So every death row inmate has a trial and has that 1st appeal. And then most have a 2nd and 3rd as well. If I'm appointed to represent somebody in that last layer, the federal layer, the federal government pays me. And the federal government right now pays at a rate of $168 per hour. When I am working on a non-death penalty case, when I'm working on a contracts case, I charge about 5 times that to clients. So the pay scale is really at the low end of what lawyers charge. In addition to that, the fact that I might send a voucher to the federal government saying I spent 100 hours on this case, so you owe me $16,800, doesn't mean they're going to pay me $16,800. There's somebody in a clerk's office who scrutinizes the voucher, and if we're lucky, we get paid 60 cents on the dollar for the time that we submit. That's federal court. State court, if I'm appointed in state court in either the 2nd or 3rd layer of the appeal, then the state pays me. Depending on which one of those appeals it is, it's either the county government or the state government. But the state has what's called a presumptive cap. And so the presumptive cap on appeals, depending on what is the nature of the appeal, the presumptive cap is $15,000, but some judges, when they appoint you, they call you up, and the judges are elected by the voters of the county. So judges in Texas are elected on a county basis, and they're going to be spending county money. And so there really aren't very many judges who are going to be facing re-election who want to create a scenario where whoever's running against them can say, hey, my opponent paid $15,000 to this lawyer to represent this convicted murderer. So there's a real pressure on county judges to get a commitment from the lawyers beforehand that they're not going to spend more than X amount of dollars. But in any event, when I get appointed to handle some kind of state appeal, it's either the county or the state that pays me. There are a very small number of cases where the person on death row actually has money, where the family has money. And so the family might hire somebody. I think that I've worked in my career on 2 cases where the parents of the person on death row had enough money to hire their own lawyers. And then finally, my team and I were the only people in Texas and really among the only people in the country who work on what we refer to as crisis litigation. Crisis litigation is just what we refer to in my office as cases where those first 3 appeals are over. So they've had their first state appeal, they've had their second state appeal, they've had their habeas appeal, that's it. Now all that's happening is they're waiting to be executed. And a lot of guys on death row will write us at that point. In fact, almost everybody on death row writes us at that point because they know that my team and I will still work on those cases if we can identify something to do. And what we do is evaluate the whole case to try to figure out if one of the earlier lawyers missed something that we think is actually promising. I mean, the earlier lawyers always miss something. It's always possible as a Monday morning quarterback to find some mistake that somebody made. So the question isn't whether we can find something. The question is whether we can find something that we think has any realistic chance of actually extending the life of our client. And we work on so many of those crisis cases that in any given calendar year, my team and I will have represented 3 out of every 5 people who were executed in Texas. So if Texas executes, 10 people in a year, we probably represented 6 of them. And most of those people will be people who we represented at the crisis stage. And at the crisis stage, nobody's paying us because we're not being appointed by the federal courts or the state courts, and the inmates don't have any money. We're basically being able to leverage that representation by the fees that we earn in other cases.
All right, Marilyn Firen.
I think you're muted, Marilyn. I think you need to unmute so I can hear you.
Okay,
There she goes.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Okay, I just wanted to know if all lawyers get assigned these cases, or are there just certain types of lawyers that get assigned these different cases?
Right. It's a very small universe of lawyers who get assigned to these cases. And it's because you have to be on a list of lawyers who are approved to handle these cases to get appointed to do them. It used to be that list was maintained, that it was a statewide list. And when it was a statewide list, I want to say that in Texas, there were maybe 40 or 50 lawyers across the state who were on the list. The lists are now maintained by individual counties. I don't really know. Well, no, I'm sorry, that's not right. There are 254 counties in Texas, and those 254 counties are divided into, I think, 16, maybe 17 judicial districts. And so each one of those districts has a list of lawyers who practice in the counties that make up that district. And in order to stay on the list, number one, you have to sign up to be on the list. No, people are not just drafted to do the work, because that would be a mistake. I mean, that would be like drafting people to fly fighter jets. I mean, you have to be trained to fly a fighter jet. So the people who are qualified to be on the list are people who have a certain degree of training. The training is defined by the different rules that the counties maintain. And then you have to regularly update that training to stay on the list. And then if you're on the list, it's hard to say that it works this way everywhere. The way it works most places is that if a judge has a case where that judge needs to appoint somebody on the list, just goes down the list. And so, if the first person on the list can't do it, you go to the second and work your way down the list that way. But I would say that statewide, in the entire state of Texas, there are maybe gosh, I don't know, 15 lawyers in private practice who do 95% of all of the death penalty work in the state. That used to be a much higher caseload than it is because, I mean, as recently as 15 years ago, Texas, we refer to people who get convicted and then sentenced to death, we refer to them as new arrivals because they're a new arrival on death row. So as recently as 15 years ago, there were 30 new arrivals a year on death row. Some years there were 35. I think one year there was 36 new arrivals on death row. I mean, that's a lot. And in recent years, that number has just absolutely plunged nationwide, but also in Texas. So last year, in 2019, there were 9 new arrivals. The year before that, there were 11. The year before that, there were 8. So, you know, we've gone from 30, 35 new arrivals to 8 or 9 or 10. And so you have about the same number of lawyers who are doing these cases, but there's much less demand on them now.
Thank you.
I think Lori has a question.
So have you ever developed a personal relationship, like one-on-one relationship with some of these people that you're representing, like where even if you think that they're guilty or whatever, you still are ingratiated yourself in each other's lives?
Almost all of them. I mean, you know, particularly in the cases where if I'm appointed to represent somebody at the beginning of what's called federal habeas, so that third stage, I'm gonna be representing that person for probably 4 years if I'm doing my job minimally well. And if I'm doing my job reasonably well, I'm gonna be representing that person for 7 or 8 years. If I get appointed to represent the person in state habeas, I might be representing the person for 9 or 10 years. After 9 or 10 years, I not only know my client really well, but I know my client's parents, I know my client's children, I know my client's siblings. I've talked to every teacher that my client had. Now, my client probably only went to school until about 8th or 9th grade, but I still talk to every teacher. I've talked to every neighbor. I've talked to every corrections officer that my client has ever had contact with. When I first started doing this work, you know, and I would tell my wife that I felt like I knew my clients better than I knew her, because she's from Germany and a lot of her relatives still live in Germany. I've never met them. Okay, I've never had a client where I haven't met every single living relative of my client. So yes, I mean, the norm is that if you're doing your job well in these cases, you know your client very, very well. And part of the reason for that is, and in fact, I would say the largest part of the reason for that is that you really only have one major job as a death penalty lawyer whose client committed the crime. If your client didn't commit the crime, your major job is to prove that your client didn't commit the crime. But if your client did commit the crime, your job is to prove that your client committed the crime but still should not be executed. And so the way that you prove or try to persuade somebody that your client should not be executed is to show the court, show the judge that your client did an absolutely horrible thing. And I'm the first to say that there is really no such thing as an okay murder. I mean, murders, they range from heinous and cruel at the low end to unspeakably detestable and vile at the other end. I mean, that's the segment of the moral spectrum that we're talking about. But it is possible, I think, very often to understand how it is that people can come to do these horrible things once you actually immerse yourself in this person's life. I mean, all of my clients are people who came into the world the same way that we did. And all of my clients are people who had the opportunity to develop the same moral sensibility, to wit, that murder is wrong, okay, that we did. But like something happened, you know, and so what is it that happened? And the role of the death penalty lawyer is to try to figure out, you know, what happened here. And I can just tell you that what often happens in these cases is the same thing that happens in every single one of these cases, which is that these kids well, by the time I meet them, they're adults. But when they were kids, they were subjected to an environment that has a transformative effect that I myself, after all of these years of doing it, literally cannot imagine growing up in, even though I've heard the stories over and over and over and over again. And I'm talking about fathers who viciously beat their children. I'm not talking about, spanking. I'm old enough that I got spanked when I was a kid. I'm talking about fathers who hit their kids with cast iron pans, who hit them with razor strops, who cut them with knives, who shoot guns at them. I'm talking about drug addicted mothers who sell their 6, 7, 8-year-old kids to pedophiles, to be abused by pedophiles so that the pedophiles pay them enough money to buy drugs. I mean, these are the sorts of things that are happening in neighborhoods in the United States of America. And it was unfathomable to me when I started doing this work. And I've now heard so many stories of this type. It doesn't even do it justice to call it abuse or dysfunction, because this is dizzying types of abuse. And I simply can't imagine it. I mean, I'm a son and a husband and a father, and I simply cannot imagine it. And yet, one of the things that I will tell you is that almost all of my clients have that biography in common. I very often have, people who are in favor of the death penalty, and I understand this. I was in favor of the death penalty. I very often have people who are in favor of the death penalty tell me, not everybody who gets abused as a kid commits murder. Okay, and I say, thankfully, that is true. And do you know what percentage of people who smoke cigarettes get lung cancer? You're going to say 75, 80, 90%. No, 22% of people who smoke cigarettes get lung cancer. So if you say, if I smoke cigarettes, am I going to get lung cancer? No, only a 1 in 5 chance. If I abuse my kid, is he going to go up to be a murderer? No, only 1 in 5 chance. But here's the thing, 98% of people who have lung cancer smoked cigarettes. And 98% of the people who were on death row were abused as kids. So does it guarantee that you're going to be on death row if you grow up in this type of environment? Absolutely not. But it almost guarantees that you're not going to be on death row if you don't grow up in that type of environment. And so what you're trying to do as a death penalty lawyer is put all those pieces together for somebody. And the result of that is that not only your client, but your client's family intimately. I mean, I would use the word intimately to describe it.
Paul has a question. Paul Herman.
At one point in your book, you mentioned something along the lines of the most important relationship, or maybe the most important aspect of any of these trials is the relationship, I think you said, of the lawyer with the jurist,
Yes.
jury. Is that even more important than the facts?
Yeah, that's a great question, Paul. Thank you. That's exactly what I say, because what happens in a death penalty trial is that even though we think of a death penalty trial as a trial, it's really 2 different trials, even though they're called phases. And at the first phase, it's called the guilt phase. And the question for the jury is, did the defendant do it? So did the defendant commit the crime that the defendant is accused of committing? And if they answer yes, then you have the second phase, which is called the punishment phase. And the question at the punishment phase is, are we going to sentence this person to life or sentence this person to death? If you have a client who you believe is innocent, as the lawyers in the book do, and so what you do at the guilt phase is try to persuade the jury that your client didn't do it, but the jury doesn't believe you. And they come in, we don't believe you. We think your client did it. We're going to convict him of murder. And the day after he gets convicted of murder, you start this second trial, this second phase. And it's the same jurors and the same lawyers. And the jurors, just think about how you yourself would behave in a situation where somebody has tried to persuade you of something and you just rejected it completely. And the next day, they're going to try to persuade you of something else. You're going to think, I don't believe these people. These people don't have credibility with me. And the problem with the lawyers is that they have tried to persuade the jury that their client didn't do it. And the jury said, we don't believe you. We think he did. And then the next day, the lawyers are trying to persuade the jury, okay, well, then don't kill my client. And the problem is that the lawyers don't have trust with the jury anymore. And it's simply a bad system. What we really should have, if we're going to have death penalty trials that work in this fashion, is we should have 2 different sets of lawyers and 2 different juries, so that we have one set of lawyers who represents a defendant at the guilt phase, and we have a jury. And if the jury convicts the person of a death eligible crime, meaning that the person is eligible for the death penalty, then we're going to have a new jury and a new set of lawyers, so that you don't have the same lawyers who have already been tainted by having the jury reject their argument on Tuesday, and now the lawyers have to persuade them of something on Wednesday. So I would say, yes, absolutely. The most important relationship at the trial is not the relationship between the lawyers and the client. It's okay if the trial lawyers and the client are getting crosswise with each other. The most important relationship at the trial is the relationship between the lawyers and the jury, because it's the jurors who have to believe the lawyers.
Does anyone else have a question for David? No? All
Well,
right.
thank you all. I've enjoyed the opportunity to talk to you very much. And if you're asleep in the middle of the night tonight and you think, God, I wish I had asked him something, then you can just reach out to Justin. He'll tell you how to get in touch with me, and just reach out to me and I'll try to answer any questions that people might have. Okay.
And a couple things. For those that haven't read the book, which I know some have, some haven't, you can even buy it in Houston. Brazos Bookstore has it actually right now for paperback for $16. There's also hardcover you can order, or more. Or I actually bought the book by Brazos Bookstore. Of course, my problem is I have good intentions, but I never really get to finish reading it. Maybe I'll try it this time. And Murr buy the book. And also, you know, if you'd like to read it and you prefer to borrow it, Judy Weidman, the librarian at Congregation Beth Israel, has offered us the opportunity to borrow the 3 copies of David's book that are in the library over there. So let me know about that. And before we go, I want to introduce Lori Ferris, and Lori is going to let us know about our next book discussion, which will be our 5th virtual book discussion coming up in November.
So like we always do after the high holidays, we join with the JCC Book Festival. Actually, I heard Dr. Dow at the JCC Book Festival last year at the local literati. He was the headliner, so I actually heard him there. This year, we're going to read as a whole community, all book clubs that we can get a hold of, or any book clubs anywhere. This is called the Community Read, and this year it was chosen to read a book called Concealed by Esther Amini. And it's a memoir, which is very unlike what we've done before, but it is a story of a Jewish Iranian daughter who left Iran and came here and was kind of caught between her Persian ways and American ways, and the religious, persecution of coming to America as a Middle Eastern Jew. So she's amazing, and this should make for a great discussion. So instead of us, I mean, it's still going to be virtually, but you would go through the JCC to get your ticket and to log on. Through the JCC, they are selling books through Brazos and someplace else, not Murder by the Book, what's it, Blue Willow. And some of the money goes towards the JCC Book Festival. And then just to let you know, the whole book festival is virtual, but it's amazing. We have some really high profile names. The whole list is going to come out because now that this is a whole virtual world, we've really reached out, and there's some incredible people coming to speak. Tonight, there's an amazing event called 9/12. It's one of the first books that came out about the 9/11 experience. I heard them speak in New York. They are just really, it's a potent subject, obviously. It's one that we need to embrace. And this is one of the first books that from this historic crisis that have come out. And so it will be tonight at 7:30, but you can still get tickets through the JCC Book Festival. And I think the price is $10. So, but there are 2 guys. The book is amazing. So, I encourage you to read Concealed. It's wonderful, and to join us there. So,
And
thanks.
when the official registration information comes out, which for some reason I think is the 21st, I could be wrong.
Yes, the 21st.
I'll be sure to shoot you all an email so you have it and can consider joining us on November 9th for the next book discussion, our 5th virtual book discussion. Who would have thought, right? When we talked to David, originally when we talked to David, I don't know, 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, we thought it'll be in person, but
Yeah.
Who knows? So,
Yeah.
but so yeah, thanks again. Thanks, David. Thanks everyone for joining us this Sunday afternoon. As David mentioned, Monday morning quarterback. I'm going to head home shortly and watch some football. So
Yeah.
have an afternoon.
Bye, everybody.